So welcome everybody. Rebecca's going to mute you now, and really glad that you're with us this evening. My name is Cynthia Cutting, and I'm from the Museum of the White Mountains. I'm very pleased to be hosting and introducing this guy here. I'm really excited to have Dave here to speak this evening. And it's easy to talk at length about David Govatski. He's a longtime friend of the museum. He's been our partner for a few exhibitions, always bringing an amazing amount of information and stories and actually a lot of artifacts. So he's been our great friend, and he is one of our wonderful advisory council members. And we're really excited to have him speaking this evening. And also, I need to mention and be grateful, I am grateful for the several advisors that are with us this evening, including our co-curator, Adam Apt, for the exhibition. Adam is here this evening, which is great. So thank you to all of our Museum of the White Mountains Advisory Council members. You truly make this organization work with your advice and support. Over the years. It's been really fantastic, and especially this year, our advisors have supported in important ways the production of this exhibition. So we're really very grateful. Also need to express our gratitude to New Hampshire Humanities for funding our speaker series this summer. The entire series is funded by the New Hampshire Humanities, and it's just been wonderful. It's helped us to reopen and welcome people back into the building with a bang, and with a great series that I'm certainly enjoying, and I'm really enjoying going back and listening again to the recordings of our talks, just learning a lot, which is really great. But I'm really glad that you all are here with us this evening, joining these people who have been supporting the museum and our members, and many of you are members. Thank you for being there for us this past year and a bit. It's been really fantastic. And if you're not a member yet, there's certainly an opportunity, and we invite you to join this wonderful group that brings to life so many aspects of the White Mountains. And this evening is Dave's bailiwick, which we're really excited. And for those of you, I know many of you do know him, but I am going to just give a little bit of an intro. As you know, he's from Jefferson, New Hampshire. And Dave retired from the U.S. Forest Service after a 30-year career as a fire and aviation management officer and forester and silviculturist. He has a Bachelor of Science in Forest Management from Unity College in Maine and a Certificate of Advanced Studies in Silviculture from the U.S. Forest Service. So as Dave was actually one of the significant advisors for this exhibition, Wayfinding Maps of the White Mountains. And over the last 3 years, as we were working on this, I discovered an affliction that I really didn't know Dave had, and he severely suffers from cartophilia. Not only does he love maps, but he also knows these White Mountains and these hills really well. As a hiker, a naturalist, a canoeer, a skier, and a snowshoer. So Dave is so well versed in this topography that the map is him and he is the map. So we're really glad that he's here to talk about this, this topic this evening. So take it away, Dave.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. That is a wonderful introduction here. And let me get my screen up here. There. Can we see the title slide?
And I did it again, Rebecca. Sorry, Dave, just to interrupt one more time. As we go through our talk, please feel free to add any questions into the chat. And at the end of today's presentation, Rebecca will bring those questions up for him to answer. So definitely go ahead and put them in there. Sorry, Dave.
Nope, no problem. Well, thank you, Cynthia and Adam, Apt co-curators, and Rebecca for running the program tonight. And I better get it going here because it's going to be 3 hours. No, just 45 minutes here. We'll go ahead and get started. But first, what I wanted to do, because this presentation really comes to you tonight from Jefferson, New Hampshire, which is part of Endocana, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki people. What they call themselves as the Alnambak, or the Umans. We acknowledge with gratitude the stewardship of the Abenaki people, past and present, who have stewarded Endocana for the last several thousand years, actually over 11,000 years with the archaeological evidence. Let's look at just some of the objectives, what we want to cover tonight. We want to understand what is a raised relief map. We want to look at some of the other techniques that cartographers, people who make maps, use in showing relief. And we want to see some of the raised relief maps that we have at the Museum of the White Mountains, along with all of the other very cool maps and map making equipment that are on display. And we can also learn where we can see other raised relief maps in the White Mountain region. And just a reminder, there will be a list of additional readings and resources. Some of them are online if you would like to take a look at that. That should be coming out tomorrow. So what is a raised relief map? It's essentially a three-dimensional representation of terrain. It's vertically exaggerated to facilitate the visual recognition of terrain features. And we also call them terrain models or three-dimensional models. And we know that they've been around for over 2,000 years, probably even longer. And today we use digital elevation models and computer graphics for producing a lot of these relief maps. But many of us, when we were growing up, we actually drew lines in the sand and made little sand maps of what we were doing. I actually had a course on making sand tables in another life. I'll tell you about that in another story sometime, but interesting on how to do it and why it's so important to understand relief maps so that you can brief people on things on terrain and other activities. So let's get started and take a look at what some of the early methods that were used in showing relief. And this is a section of the Philip Kerrigan map, famous map of 1816. There was another version in 1818. He used hatchers, and hatchers, some people call them caterpillars, but they're hatchers is the technical name. They're short parallel lines with the closer they get indicates it's quite a bit steeper. And what you see on the right side of the Kerrigan map, that's actually the Mount Washington range. And I think Adam Apt, our co-curator, calls this a cruciform hatcher because it's in the shape of a cross. But hatchers were around a long time. And even though contour lines have been around a long time, they were just not widely accepted. Here's the Harvey Boardman map. And these maps are on display at the Museum of the White Mountains, so you'll have a chance to see it in addition to the raised relief maps. So you see a lot of these hatchers published in 1858. Let's take a look at a blow-up of that particular one, showing Mount Washington. If you can see where my cursor is, Mount Washington, and then you can see Mount Clay, and you can see Mount Adams, and then Mount Jefferson. And if you've hiked this, you realize that really Jefferson should be where Adams is. So that was a mistake, surprising mistake, but it was corrected in later editions. But the hatchers show up really well. This is the Great Gulf right in here. Not a particularly bad map, certainly. It's got a good representation of the Mount Washington Auto Road and the Mount Washington Cog Railway, Lakes of the Clouds, and some of the other mountains. Crystal Falls, we call that Crystal Cascade right now. This is probably one of the first records of a raised relief map. This was produced by Professor Hitchcock. And this comes out of a book called Mount Washington in Winter. It was published in 1871. So we believe that this particular raised relief map, it's really kind of hard to tell how to make sense of it, but essentially this is, again, the Mount Washington Auto Road and the Cog Railway going down here. This would be Crawford Notch through here. And the dimensions are interesting. It's a fairly large, made it out of plaster of Paris. It's 3 by 5 feet. And the scale was interesting. He uses an inch equals 139 rods. And probably in this audience, maybe some of you know what a rod is, but essentially a rod is a measurement that's still used today in surveying. A rod is 16.5 feet. It's a quarter of a chain, which is 66 feet. I did the calculations and I came out actually with a scale that we are much more familiar with, 1 to 27,522. Most of us are familiar with the U.S. Geological Survey topographic maps, the quadrangle maps, and many of them have a scale of 1 to 24,000. What's interesting is that last week I was down with Bob Cottrell. He's the historian at the Conway Historical Society. He actually showed me a copy of the Hitchcock raised relief map that was found, and it's a waiting restoration at the Conway Historical Society, but pretty interesting. It came out of the Kearsarge house. But it's in pretty good shape, better than what my photograph actually shows. Now, the first commercial raised relief map was produced in 1872 by George Snow and Charles Bradley, and had a wooden frame. I've actually come across these for $25, $35, $40, and I think the antique dealers just don't realize what they have. This is a map that is very close to being 150 years old. It's an interesting map. I think it's nicely done. Produced in Boston. This is a blow up of the title. It covers an area 55 by 70 miles, a very light wooden frame, made out of paper mache, which is essentially mashed wood fiber, which is a pretty common map making material, even to this day. It's somewhat what we call hypsometric in that it has a color tinting for elevation. The green areas are below 1,000 feet and the white are above 1,000 feet. So in 1872, when they were selling this, it was $1.50. And if you look today and you do the math and calculate inflation, it's worth about $33.20 in today's money. It did have advertising on it, and primarily for the railroads, but I'm really not sure how you would use this other than as a novelty map and perhaps as a planning device where you could get a number of people together, like raised relief maps are frequently used today. You're going to be able to look at this and share with your friends. Well, let's go here. We'll start in Franconia Notch and we'll hike over the Franconia Range into Crawford Notch and so forth. So that's probably how it was used. Another map came out just 7 years later. We don't know about the commercial success of these, but we've seen enough of these. The Shedler map of 1879, I haven't seen that many, and it was, again, an interesting map in that the scale 1 inch to 5 miles, and it folds in half. Produced in Jersey Heights, New Jersey, compiled by Appalachian Mountain Club members, and it's composed of pressed cardboard, has that gradient tinting and spot elevations. Let's take a close-up look. Well, let's take a look at the cover first. And the cover is a very, very dark green. We weren't able to lighten it very much, but when you go to the exhibit at the museum, and maybe Rebecca can get a better photo than I was able to get here, and you'll be able to see what it says. So it's considered to be the satchel edition that they have. So here's a picture, a close-up. And if you can see my cursor in the center here is N Zealand River. This area used to be called the New Zealand River. There was a post office here called New Zealand, and they later, the Postal Service later just shortened it to Zealand. But on most of these raised relief maps, prominently mentioned, and in fact, the early maps, they really use a lot of red ink on the railroads because those were the important means of transportation. But this particular map here covers, essentially the area what we call Twin Mountain today to Bretton Woods, and you can see the Sugarloaves, you can see the Nubble, South Twin, Franconia Range, and that. This one uses Mount Clinton, and many of the maps you'll see are Mount Pierce. I still like to use Mount Clinton because being botanically oriented, DeWitt Clinton was a famous botanist, and I know Deb Levins is here on the program this evening, and she's familiar with DeWitt Clinton and the plant called Clintonia borealis, or blue bead lily. So just a little sidelight to that. And you can actually see where the railroad, the Boston and Maine, went up to connect with the Mount Washington Cog Railway. So railways were really important. And to the native peoples, the streams were really important. That's what their transportation system. We heard from Paul and Denise Pulio a couple of weeks ago on their program on Native American place names. So this is somewhat of a chronological look at maps. And so I just wanted to have a little sidebar here that the U.S. Geological Survey was created in 1879, and their first topographic map was produced in 1882, and they were essentially told by Congress they can start mapping the U.S. in 1884, and they started a survey in Gorham in 1884. And it actually took a long time in the White Mountains. I think it took until 1931 for the Chicorwa region to get fully mapped. In the upper left corner is the logo that they used from 1879 to 1979, 100 years. I really like that logo. I think it's a lot more descriptive. It tells you, what they do, and that the newest logo is on the bottom there, and it has USGS, and a little hard to decide what it is, but that's what they have. It's a great agency. They do good work, and not just mapping, but lots of other things related to geography. Let's talk a little bit about elevation tinting, or what cartographers call hypsometric tinting. And that involves the use of different colors for different maps. And it's a concept that Leonardo da Vinci developed in 1503, so a long, long time ago. And it's a concept that Henry Walling, in his map of the White Mountains in 1881, incorporated. He used 100-foot contour intervals, and he also included this hypsometric, or tinting for elevation. Had pretty good scale on it at 1 inch to 2.5 miles. And it's my favorite map, absolutely, of the 1800s. So let's take a look at the 1881 Walling close-up map of the White Mountains. And as you can see here, this elevation tinting helps a lot. There's contour lines. Contour lines for some people just don't stick out as much as the elevation tinting that you see here. So it's another means of showing relief. And even today, we see a lot of tinting for elevation being a pretty good idea to go with that. So that's my choice for my favorite map of the 1800s. There's another type of method, a technique that cartographers use to show relief that isn't raised relief. This is called oblique or bird's eye view. This particular one is of the White Mountains, and it's an advertising promotion from the Boston and Maine Railroad in 1886. One that we have on display at the Museum of the White Mountains, and it's quite popular. I think you can actually buy the reproductions in stores today. It's the bird's eye view. of Mount Washington for the Boston and Maine Railroad. There's 3 or 4 editions that came out, and it's essentially a view as if you were, I guess, a raven flying over, and you can actually see a map, in this case, a circular map with all of the buildings and their corresponding numbers and letters that are associated with it. And I think it went for 25 cents. And if you want to buy an original from 1908, you know, as a collector, I've seen them up, you know, $500–600 for collectors. And it's on fairly thin paper, but they frame nicely and worth checking out. They're a beautiful piece of art. And there's a panorama all the way around it. And so it was a very, very clever way of map making in the early 1900s. So we're going to take a fairly long leap here. There were maps that came out in the teens and the 20s, but we're going to go to Pinkham Notch Camp, which tended to be a hotbed of cartography in the 1930s. And this is a picture of the old trading post. And I guess I have to admit that I used to work there when they still had a trading post. I was there in the transition before the new trading post that came in. But I wanted to point out the sign that's here, and we'll be talking about a person who actually made this particular brass relief here. It was a person that I'm really quite impressed by. It's Rodney Dean Woodard. He made raised relief maps of the White Mountains in the basement of the Pinkham Notch trading post. He got his first copyright in 1929. I mean, he was an amazing person. He went to the Wentworth Institute. He studied metal smithing, woodworking. He was an artist, a sculptor, a musician. He loved classical music. Just an amazing person. And he started off at the Lakes of the Clouds hut and worked at other huts in 1926, and then he became the assistant AMC huts manager from 1931 to 1937, working with Joe Dodge as his assistant. And he developed a process for producing these raised relief maps, which are, you know, quite fascinating. They're fairly small. There are 3 versions of the small ones: the Crawford Notch, Franconia Notch, and the Mount Washington Range. And there was also a larger one, and we'll take a look at them in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to point out the profile here. In 1930, he was talking with a guy by the name of C.T. Bodwell, who was working for the Society of Protection of New Hampshire Forest, running the Flume facility, essentially, which was the Forest Society had helped acquire. The state wasn't able to run it, and Bodwell was running it. He was an amazing person in his own right. Bodwell's a fairly famous photographer. Hundreds of different postcards, but working with his friend Rodney Woodard, he convinced him. He says, you know, you need to put a sketch of something on there. He says, how about the Old Man of the Mountain? So this particular profile of the Old Man of the Mountain that we fondly remember was done by Woodard, and it actually helped in the marketing. So a lot of these people were working together. Philip Ayres, for instance, was working with Woodard and Bodwell, and quite interesting to see this. So here's the larger version. It's either 7x10 or 6x10, depending on how it's trimmed. Scale is 1 inch to the mile. And this picture was actually taken by Adam App of his copy. And what he did was he had a light that came on the upper left side, northwest side of this map, to show how it would look if it would be shaded relief. And I'll talk a little bit more about shaded relief in a little bit. But this version of the map is quite impressive. It has many of the trails of the northern peaks and Mount Washington, and of course the auto road and all of that. And I've said before, Rodney Woodard is the Leonardo da Vinci of the White Mountains based on his skills. They're really quite comparable. One's from Italy and one, of course, is from here in the White Mountains. But as an inventor, as a person with multiple patents, Rodney Woodard did so many different things. So here's a close-up view of his raised relief map of the Mount Washington range, and then we have the Franconia range. They essentially, Rodney used two colors, blue for water and black for essentially terrain features. He had a variety of molds. One was a bronze mold. This is on display again at the Museum of the White Mountains, as these other maps are also. So he experimented with different kinds of metal. And I think going to school at the Wentworth Institute was very beneficial to him, because here's another example of what he did. This thing is heavy. This thing on the bottom, I lifted it up. It's got to be 20 pounds. And it's pretty heavy bar of steel right here. So it's a cast iron mold. This is what he made his Big Mount Washington range map. And this one, I think this was the Franconia range. This is a smaller version. And so these are cast iron map molds that Woodard designed himself. And he found out that he needed to vent the gas coming out of there. And so he actually, on this map that I was checking out at the Conway Historical Society, they got an amazing collection of Rodney Woodard stuff. And there's actually a vent that comes out here, and there's thumb screws that essentially hold it down. So Woodard used these printing plates, and these plates were, commonly used. I believe they were made out of lead. And again, he used the black for the terrain features and the blue for the streams. And going along here, you can see a flat sheet on the left. These crosses here, they're crosses. Those are the registration marks that he used. So he would print out essentially on a flat celluloid sheet. He would put the two colors, you get the black, and then he would do the blue. And so he would have essentially a flat sheet. Then he would put it in a mold, and that mold would essentially create it when you used heat. He used a material called celluloid, which was invented by the British in 1856, which is a mixture of nitrocellulose and camphor. And we often hear about this in, Hollywood movies that are stored in these old tin cans, and they're quite explosive, very, very flammable. And so celluloid is still being used. Anybody who plays table tennis or what we call ping pong is familiar with celluloid, and those things do burn. When I was a kid, I knew that. So just a little side note here. So anyways, that's the flat sheet. And here's the large Mount Washington range map. This is essentially a proof. And then this has to be cut. Rodney put it in cardboard boxes, sold it at many local stores. He had orders from all over the country. So the small map, the wholesale price was 40 cents, and the retail price was 75 cents. And I know that C.T. Bodwell at the Flume Reservation was trying to make the point that he wanted to buy them for 35 cents. He was a good businessman. He said, we're not open in the winter, and it's a lot of storage for us to have here. So would you be willing to sell them for 35 cents? And we'll just sell more of them. So Rodney agreed. But today, a map like this would be, in today's money, with inflation, it'd be around $12, a little over $12. Rodney would buy 500 cardboard boxes at a time. And I actually had a chance to look at his invoices and the records. Again, they're at the Conway Historical Society. Somebody could write a book about this guy, and it would be fascinating. Maybe I should do it, but one of these years. And he would buy 500 boxes from a company in Maine, and doing business with a lot of local contractors, and you learn about getting the copyrights. The copyrights would be $3, $4, $5. He was using his friends that worked in the hut system that had moved on from the huts and became lawyers, and so I'm sure he got a pretty good deal on that. But quite fascinating. Now, he also produced these paper copies of relief maps. I've seen postcards that he's done of relief maps. And so he was involved in making all kinds of different things. And this is a little bit of an aside, but I know that many of you are skiers, and Pinkham Notch in the 1930s, I mean, that was part of the golden age of skiing that we had. We had it again in the 1970s. And it was very popular at Pinkham. Many of these old trails were actually reopened. So Woodard, in addition, he worked closely with a person by the name of Bob Monahan, who was a superintendent of Civilian Conservation Corps camp, a forestry person who knew how to make maps, and together they did some of the mapping of that area. I've got a couple copies of the Monahan maps. But this particular map, and it's impressive because he used these latitude, longitude lines. And I've actually seen some of the edits that were done. People wrote in, said, it didn't go on this particular side of the stream and so forth. But he actually mapped out, if you look at the summit of Mount Washington on your left here, you can see he mapped out the snowfields that were here. And he mapped out, if you're familiar with Pinkham Notch Camp on Route 16, and if you've ever hiked up the Square Ledge, you'll know that below Square Ledge is fairly open area with young trees. This was a practice slope in the 1930s that they had actually ski instructors that came from Conway and worked out of Pinkham, and they taught people. But they had all of these other trails. You had the Gulf of Slides Trail, and then you had the original location of the Harvard Mountaineering Club. Then you had, of course, the Glen House, which again was the center of skiing, and you had open slopes and that. And in the 1930s, and you remember that this was the height of the Great Depression, and these maps were produced and drawn by Rodney Woodard, and they came out in various years. As far as I know, there were 5 editions. The 1938 map does not have a date on it, but I'm pretty sure it was done in 1938, based on some of the trails that were on it. And then there might have been a 1939 one, because in 1938 there was a big hurricane, and I can see that some of the trails were actually erased. So that 6x9 inch, again, these are on display at the Museum of the White Mountains, and if you're interested, I'm sure Rebecca would be happy to send you some high resolution scans of these particular maps. And Rodney got married to a woman from Gorham, and they moved to the Jackson area, and then a little later on to Intervale, or part of North Conway. And Woodard would produce these maps. This is a ski map of Jackson. You might say it's one of the first ski area maps that we have, because Jackson was one of those early centers. And of course, Woodard had those 1933 maps that showed many of the same things. So we have slopes and we have trails here, and we have the lodges and that. So even today, when you buy maps, you'll often find advertising from the hotels and the various places that are associated with that. And so maybe Rodney was one of the pioneers, but just gorgeous maps. And he also did this somewhat of a unique map, Camp Idlewild, if you're familiar with Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, on the border with Quebec. And he has these circular lines going out from the lodge, and just how far you are from Camp Idlewild. Camp Idlewild, by the way, was later became a CCC camp. So just a picture of Rodney. There's several pictures out there, but this is an amazing thing. I got this out of Popular Mechanics magazine, and he found a 200-pound birch burl in northern Maine, and he made a bowl out of it. He spent 100 hours on it. He actually developed a machine that did the carving, and then on the bottom he put on a bas relief of a diagram of river drivers on the Androscoggin River. So an amazing artist, and so versatile in so many ways. And one of the links that will be on your additional resources tomorrow, you'll actually have a chance to see some of the other work that he did. He designed the AMC pack frame called the freighter frame at the time, got a patent for it. A lot of these bronze images and that. All right, let's move on now to the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was heavily involved in the White Mountains. There were 16 camps alone that the National Forest operated in the White Mountains from 1933 to 1942. We'll be talking more about the Thornton camp. They were somewhat of a specialized camp, and they made raised relief maps, not just for the White Mountains, but for all over the eastern United States, what was called the Eastern region, all the way down in Virginia and West Virginia and Carolinas and that. In Pennsylvania. So on the left is a copy of the map that is in the lower level of the Museum of the White Mountains, in the lower level exhibit room. So I encourage you to see it. It's heavy. I know the crew that had to move it. It's hundreds of pounds, and it's a very intricate process. And the photo on the right, I found it in the archives of the U.S. Forest Service. It was a picture showing essentially the same map before it was painted. And here's a picture of a Civilian Conservation Corpsman using a specialized machine. It's somewhat like a sewing machine, but it was developed for cutting out these material. It was called a cut-all machine. And there's a book called what's it called here? It's A Builder of Men. It's David Drave's book on the life in the CCC camps in the White Mountains. And so I was reading a story about one of the people that actually worked at the Thornton camp, and he describes what it was like. They had their own, they had two buildings, two shanties essentially, one that they lived in, very specialized housing, and one that they actually made these maps. And this guy here is a forester by the name of Siebert, who was just inspecting the work that was being done. And so a lot of these guys didn't want to do the pick and shovel work. And this guy, I think, had maybe some mechanical drafting. The story I read was one guy had 5 years of mechanical drafting. So he's just an ideal person to put in the map making thing. If you look on his shoulder of the corpsman here, you'll see this brass badge here. And I actually have a copy of it in my collection. And this was for that particular company. And the Civilian Conservation Corps, if I can digress a little bit, they actually had three different titles for each camp. Most of us would call it the Thornton camp because it was located in Thornton. It was the closest railroad station was West Campton. The Forest Service, they had another designation. They called it NF9, which means that it's a National Forest Camp number 9 in the White Mountains. And then the administration of that was essentially the military, gave it a company name. And this is a particular 4-digit thing here. And it actually is pretty easy to decode. If it's 3 digits, 101, it just relates to a particular Army Corps area. And the first Corps was New England. And the first iteration of a camp would be 01. And actually that first camp was at the Wild River Camp in the White Mountains, essentially near Kinsman Notch. But when they ran out of the first 100 numbers, which they did because there were about 3,500 camps, they would go to the next number. So the Thornton camp ended up with being 101, but the first number is the first Corps. If it was a 2, it'd be second Corps, which is New York and there. Anyways, I digress. Let's get back to maps here. So here we are, the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of the effort of the CCC. One of the most successful projects in during the Depression was to put unemployed young men to work, to get them off the street, to learn a useful skill that they could be using in the future. And so they had classes on making relief maps as part of their educational effort. And then here you have a crew of people that are actually taking a look. These are completed maps, and these are about to be shipped out. They're going to be crated and shipped out to various national forests and national parks around the country. So an interesting effort by the Civilian Conservation Corps. They had plenty of enrollees, and they had plenty of time, and they did a really high quality project. So I urge you to take a look at the relief model that's in the lower level of the Museum of the White Mountains. So moving on, 1937, let's take a look at another type of a map, and we call this shaded relief. This particular one was very popular. It still is popular today. It's one of my favorite maps. I just think Margaret Austin did a phenomenal job of showing the White Mountains, and I particularly like how she used vignettes, these little scenes of what life was like. You can see a high country cabin over here on the left. I think that's the Kinsman cabin that's no more, but the National Geographic Society did a phenomenal job with that. And here's a little bit of a blow up. And what's interesting about this, I was just talking about the CCC. There's actually 4 CCC camps in this 1937 map. We got off the Kankakee, got the Passaconaway CCC camp, Swift River camp, and the Saco River camp over here near Bartlett, and then which got flooded out, and they all had to move over to a new camp here at Livermore. But essentially, shaded relief, it's a technique that cartographers use as if there's a light source, we'll say the sun, that's shining from the northwest. I know that's not where the sun typically is, but what it does is you shade that opposite side, and it really gives you an idea of relief. And the U.S. Geological Survey in 1946, they put out the Crawford Notch quadrangle, which is absolutely one of my favorite quadrangles that was done. They had a shaded relief version and a regular version. They also did one for Katahdin in Maine, but I think Crawford's is probably my absolute favorite. This is, again, another sidebar. University of New Hampshire Library had this this website, and they have it now in their archives still. So you might want to check out this link here, and you can actually look at all of these historic maps, and you can do it by quad or you can do it by town. Those are the 2 easy ways. And you can also do an image map, but it's not that easy. So let's take a look. I'm going to look at a particular quad. I wanted to see the Crawford Notch one, and you can see there was one done in 1896, and you can actually take a look at the content. You can go to the northwest corner. It's hard to tell unless you have a map in front of you where you want to go, but you can figure it out pretty quick. 1946, you can see that there's also a shaded relief version here, and so it's just a great way to look at historic maps because they're important. You can see what was here before. This came from Becky Fullerton at the AMC archives at the Highland Center, Crawford Notch. This is Robert Scott's raised relief map of the Mount Washington Range. It's a 1953 map. I like the scale. It's 1 inch to the mile. It's pretty easy to work with. And he actually used balsa wood, pretty light material. And Becky has this in the archives at the Highland Center. It's really neat. Another map, this is over at the Pinkham Notch camp. Many of you are familiar with it. This is the Rauda Mount Washington Range map. It was done around 1990 at a price of about $15,000. Walter Graff had just was working for the AMC, and he got permission to they were redoing the visitor center to go ahead and to get a terrain model, and they did this. It was very impressive. So he actually got to talk with Vigo Rauda, who is a Latvian refugee. How many Latvians do you know? But Vigo was an amazing person and established this company in Seattle, Washington. He's since passed away, but they still produce hundreds of these terrain models, and I'll have a link that you can get later, Rauda scale models. So pretty interesting. Let's take a look at the close-up. Well, first of all, let's take a look. It's the centerpiece of the AMC Pinkham Notch camp. Every time I go there, there's people looking at it. They're pointing to, we were here, we're going there. This is what the terrain is like. It's such a great planning device. And you can see a close-up of the trails. That's been there for 30 years, and it's still in pretty good shape. You don't want to have people touching it with insect repellent and sunscreen and sweat and all those other things. So I'm sure they have to touch it up, but you do want to use a little bit of care on that. the Rauta map actually used the Brad Washburn map. I actually got a different one here, but similar to Brad's maps. It's probably the most accurately surveyed map of the White Mountains, the work that was done in the 1980s. It was using really a Swiss style of map making. And if you look, he also did one of Tuckerman Ravine. He did one of the trails around Pinkham. This, I just did a quick scan of the Lionhead area here. And you can see the symbology for the cliffs. He actually has symbols for boulders. You don't see this on the U.S. Geological Survey maps. And he uses these different vegetation symbols here. So just a wonderful map and one of the most attractive maps that have been done of the White Mountains. And I don't know how easy the Tuckerman Ravine map is to buy. I know they're out of print, but you'll see them at stores. Another map is another terrain map. This is at the Highland Center. Edward Rolfe was contracted by Chris Thayer and I think Nancy Ritker to produce a very basic and rugged raised relief map of Crawford Notch at the Highland Center. It's 2 by 3 feet and 1:20,000 scale. He used foam core material, 3/16 inch. This paper mache, a lot of glue, Elmer's glue, oil paint, acrylic spray, and AMC construction crew, one of their carpenters, built a beautiful frame. And the idea here was that young people, they're going to want to touch things. And Ed had to build this thing rugged enough so that all those grimy paws could be touching it. And what he did was, Edward Rolfe puts out a map of Crawford Notch, and he essentially used the same footprint, and he just enlarged the scale. And it's quite a process that he did, and I don't want to get into detail on his secret sauce, but here's a close-up of it, and it's still there. And again, it's an older map, and it's still in good shape, and people are constantly using it. Kids love it. So it is a touch model. 2007, Larry Garland worked with solid terrain modeling to create this beautiful map that's at the Intervale Visitor Center. And if you get a chance to go down there, solid terrain modeling does some pretty good work. And I'm going to have a video on the link that you can see on how they actually made it. And this is essentially what it is. But it's a computer-driven router, and then they paint it with an inkjet printer with a multi-axis head. It tilts and swivels. The video is just amazing. You can see it. So Larry, who's a cartographer for the AMC, provided the digital elevation model for the terrain and also a map overlay. So essentially, you can see what the vegetation is like. A company out of Madison, the Architectural Woodworking, built a beautiful frame. And I got to give a shout out to Cynthia Briggs, Ed Bergeron, and Earl Sires, who wrote a grant to get this done. Even though it's a national scenic byway, the White Mountain Byway, there was no money for this. And so these three folks actually wrote a grant. This describes the process. They use this large block of high density polyurethane. They have that DEM, the digital elevation model, that uses the cutting machines. Hey, if you're looking for a job, learn how to run a CNC machine. They are in demand. You're going to make $50 an hour, a lot more than I ever did as a forester. Anyways, they carve it into the blocks of foam, and then they apply these various coatings, and then they give this digital image, which is very accurate. And then they coat it with an acrylic material, and so they can put it together. 2014, this is one of the most popular raised relief maps that's currently out there. I think they sell for about $40, at least at the Highland Center, probably Pinkham too. It's a 4,000-footer raised relief map with a vertical exaggeration that you see here. It's got hypsometric color toning. It's got an inset of Mount Washington right here. And for many of us, it's really important to have this checklist here, all of the 4,000 footers that we can do. So really a pretty neat map. You can buy it locally. Steve Smith at Mountain Wanderer in Lincoln has them, I'm pretty sure, and you can get them at many other places. A lot of you grew up with the Hubbard 3D map company. Just a quick note that they ran out of business in October 2019. Casualty, I'm sure, of COVID, business was way down. But the Map Shop and Metzger's Maps are now producing that series that you might be interested in. And we're almost at the end here. I wanted to bring up a really beautiful new map. Lindsey Gonzalez of Ridgeline Glass has produced these cast glass terrain models, and they're gorgeous. They're called dichroic because there's a special coating on it, and so you hold it in the sun and it comes out with different colors. They're custom made, although I understand that the Museum of the White Mountains might be selling some, so keep your eye out here. But they're just gorgeous. They'll fit right in your hand. Obviously, they're not recommended to take out on the Gulf Side Trail or up Boot Spur or anything like that, but they're worth getting. I ordered one. I said, I got to have one of these. Oh, and just a quick aside, I used to have a raised relief map made out of chocolate of the Mount Washington range, but it disappeared. The wrapper's still there, but I don't know what happened to the chocolate. I guess I ate it. Anyway, she does custom work. Lindsey is again, an artist and does sculpture, works in glass. And because the Museum of the White Mountains is not just about history, it's about art and science and all of these technology and all these other things. It's important to include her work in this because it is so interesting. And finally, you can go to the Conway Public Library, and I think it's Jack Beaver who's working with young people in a 3D machine that actually will make you a map of the Mount Washington Range for about $2. So that's something to consider. So I wanted to mention next week's program. Mark Thomas, a retired middle school science teacher, he's going to be talking actually about 4,000 footer club maps of the peaks. He's going to have a great program next week, so tune in for that. But he's also got a display on that's really appropriate for both children and adults to learn how to make your own maps, and it's in the little cubby hole that we have at the Museum of the White Mountains, and be sure to see that. So again, I'd like to thank all of the people who participated in helping me put this program together. And with that, I will see the curtains and see if there's any questions. And I'll stop sharing.
Oh, Dave, that was wonderful. I especially love that curtain at the end. That was very theatrical. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh my
Well,
God.
I was actually hoping that I wasn't on mute the whole time.
We would have told you.
Oh, good, good.
So definitely, if you have questions for Dave, put them in the chat. Boy, I learned a lot. And I love your identification of Woodard as the Leonardo da Vinci of the area. I think that's pretty smart. It's smart, yeah. Isn't it interesting how these are such, the art and the science of these maps is absolutely kind of blends together, because those hashers are something that you learn as an art student. So.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So, that's the contour lines and drawing.
Oh, sure.
Figures and objects. That's something that you learn in art school, exactly those same kind of techniques. So really cool.
All right. Well, if you're ready for questions, we've got our first question from Marcia. Do you know any more about Snow and Bradley, the makers of the 1872 map? What was their purpose in making the map?
Well, perhaps Adam can add a little bit to this, but I think the primary purpose was a commercial venture that was in combination with advertising revenue. And I think that was their commercial enterprise. They wanted to produce a product that they could sell and make money on, and they were particularly good at that. I think it'd be interesting. I need to do some more research on them just to see how successful it is, but from my initial research, I was not able to find any indication that it was a very successful thing. And I think the number of editions kind of tells you that, well, they did it. The same thing with the Shedler map. It was done once. Maybe they produced a certain number. There's even a question whether it was produced in Boston or in Germany, and which is controversial, I think, with some of the map makers who think that, you know, the snow map was the first commercial raised relief map of our region. So it may not have been, but I suspect it probably was. Thanks for the question, Marcia.
She says thank you. All right. Got some wonderful comments here. Thanks, Dave. This is from Chris Thayer. Thanks, Dave, for the extra information on Rodney Woodard, especially that he was an AMC assistant HUTS manager as a former HUTS manager himself. So that's great. Oh, and
yeah, I included a link to the resuscitator. It's the OH Association, for those that are, you know, veterans of working for the HUD system, that has, I think it's like a 6 or 7 page article. You can see it online with lots of color pictures, and you'll learn a lot more about Rodney Woodard that I just couldn't include tonight. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Let's see, Adam had a comment. So the snow map, even today, isn't rare, but the Shudler map is extremely rare. The copy on display in our wayfinding exhibit is the only one that he's ever seen. Very interesting. Thank you, Adam. Question from Becky Fullerton. Any idea where the Burl Bowl ended up?
You know, I do. He worked for the forerunner of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, and for some reason, I think it ended up in Berlin, but I'll have to look into that. I'll get back to you on that, Becky. That would be interesting to find out. And I'm going to be doing some research next Wednesday, a little bit more on Rodney, and I'll see if I can track it down. I think it'd be great to have popcorn in that next time around. No, I think salad's probably a little better for you. Okay.
Let's see. Another question from Marcia. What was it about the 1870s that led to the amazing start, to relief maps?
I think the key thing was the railroads. It was the, you know, getting the railroad through Gorham, and then through Crawford Notch, and the opening of tourism, all of the hotels, and I think the artists were, you know, some of the big conveyors of interest, because there was, you know, there is some competition between the eastern slope and the western side of the mountains, but eastern slope had really a lot of members of the White Mountain School of Art that were producing some really great work, and you can say maps are really a form of art, and so it just really attracted people, and it was just the cycle that, you know, more people that came, they produced the products, more trails were built, and more hotels were built, and that.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Another comment from Adam. It is reported that the first 3D relief map of the White Mountains was made out of plaster of Paris by a president of Harvard. It no longer exists. So thank you, Adam.
Yeah, that's in the book, the Winter on Mount Washington. So if you have that book, it's kind of a fun book. Hitchcock wrote the first 4 chapters of that. Oh, I should mention about Hitchcock, you know, we talked about the Hitchcock raised relief map, but in the exhibit at the Museum of the White Mountains, we have a number of Hitchcock's actual geology maps that are on display that are quite spectacular.
Yes, they're very cool. Thank you. Lovely comment from Kathy. Thanks. Appreciate how art and science weave together in mapping. As a painter and hiker, I learned a lot and have always loved relief maps. I loved seeing the room-sized one of Denali in Talkeetna, Alaska.
That is a big one. It's mostly white too. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that one too. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. I think that seems like it is it for questions. So there are a lot of wonderful comments. People really enjoyed this presentation, Dave. So thank you.
Right. Thank you, Dave. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. Yeah, definitely. I like all the virtual clapping. That's awesome. And as Dave said, don't miss next week's talk by Mark Thomas. That'll be a really interesting talk about his process. But yes, thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate you. And I hope that if you haven't been to the museum yet to see the exhibit, it's definitely worth the trip. So I hope you can make it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Dave.